I've tried out an airbrush for the first time, and I wanted to share my experience. If you're interested in airbrushing, then hopefully this video can help you out. So my first airbrush experience initially started with the fact that I got my hands on an entirely new army. I decided to build a stormcast army for Age of Sigmar. And I wanted to get it on the table relatively quickly. Try out the airbrush, get the army done fast. This is obviously my initial experience with an airbrush. I've had the airbrush for about a month and painted about 40 miniatures. I painted an army. So I'm obviously not an expert when it comes to the airbrush. But I wanted to share my experience. For one thing, my channel is about me trying out new things and sharing that experience. But also, if you would, if you're considering buying an airbrush, then if you get one, then your first month would be sort of like my first month. There's a couple of manufacturers of airbrushes. Specifically, the one I've been trying out is a Neo from Iwata. And it's a small compressor from Iwata as well, called a Ninja Jet. I think this comes like in a starter kit. But that's sort of my first tip, if possible, is, this is a fairly hefty investment. And if you want to try out airbrushing, see if you can borrow an airbrush from someone, or if you've got an acquaintance or a friend that's got an airbrush, if you could try theirs out. That's what I did. This isn't mine. I borrowed this one from a friend. So sort of in layman's terms, how does an airbrush work? Well, first of all, this is called a gravity-fed airbrush, which means that you've got this little cup up top where you pour your paint in, and thanks to Mr. Newton, the paint flows down and gets mixed with air and squirted out. There's also airbrushes where you sort of screw on a bottle of paint down under the bottom. I don't even actually know what they're called because I'm not much of a researching kind of fellow. But you don't want them for miniature painting. So if you're looking at an airbrush, you should get a gravity-fed airbrush. Now, basically, inside an airbrush, you got a needle, which if you screw this apart, you can see that inside here we've got a needle. Now, basically, this needle, it goes right through the airbrush and plugs a little hole up front. And when you pull this lever, the needle gets pushed back, the hole opens, and paint comes out. The airbrush is then fed with regular compressed air. And the compressor has, hopefully, the ability to adjust the strength of the amount of air that's being pushed through to the airbrush, i.e. sort of air pressure or PSI. And basically, the higher you've got your air pressure, the more sort of force you've got, the more paint you can squirt out. And naturally the other way around. If you've got a really low sort of PSI, then you can hopefully squirt out less amounts of paint and maybe do more detail work. So apart from the airbrush and the compressor, what more do you need to be able to airbrush? Well, obviously paint. And, you can use whatever paint you've got. There are specific airbrush paints by different manufacturers, but the regular paint that you use to paint with your brush, be it Citadel, Vallejo, Scale Color, Army Paint, or whatever, you can airbrush with that stuff. But it needs to be thinned down because the paint that you use for a brush is designed to stick in a brush. But it's too thick for the airbrush to push that paint through, so it needs to be thinned down. And that's where you can use different things. There's thinner, that sort of dilutes the paint. There is a flow improver, which sort of improves the flow of the paint. Some people use water. I'll be talking more about these sort of later down the line in the video. You also need airbrush cleaner to be able to sort of keep your airbrush clean. There's also the thing with water. Like, I was out in the country house. There's a lot of sort of different, different mineral kind of residue things in the water out in the country house. And I didn't, you can see if you've got it, usually if you've got sort of where you boil your water, like a water cooker, and it's all sort of kind of white on the inside. I didn't want my airbrush to be sort of all white on the inside. So I used iodized, try saying that articulately, water, pure H2O. There's got nothing in it but like water. Also, the thing with an airbrush is that it's not toxic fumes going. Like with a rattle can, there's a lot of propellants in there to squirt the spray out. This is just compressed air, but you get dust going, like air dust. And being in the country house, this was the best sort of kind of protection that I could find. You could probably have something more advanced, but I'm guessing, you don't want to inhale paint particles the rest of your life. So you also need sort of breathing protection. What else do you need? Well, here's the big thing. You need somewhere to be able to airbrush. You need a space. And that's been my big thing. Why I haven't got an airbrush is because I'm in my living room. And this time, because I was going to the country house, I sat in a wood workshop and airbrushed, which was fine because it was already kind of dirty there, and a little bit of dust, paint dust doesn't really matter. But this is the big thing. If you've got a hobby space where you've got enough space, or if you've got sort of like a separate kind of little room somewhere that, it doesn't matter if you get some dust in there, you're fine. There's also different solutions of like little boxes with ventilation that you can connect with the hose and put out through the window and things like that. So how much dust do you get? Well, I was kind of surprised. It really depends on how you paint. I started out painting my entire army with this stuff, which is a surface primer from Vallejo. I'm not going to say I was heavy with it, but I surface primed these odd 40 miniatures that I was going to paint later on, and that kind of got a bit dusty. But then all the rest of the work, where I was more sort of detailed and a bit more controlled, I hardly even got sort of paint on my dust on my fingers. There was hardly any dust on the surface underneath. So I'm guessing in the big sort of scale of things, you can kind of actually control how much dust there is going to be. But I can tell you that when I started out, the first thing that happened when I surface primed this many miniatures with the black is I had fairly a big amount of dust in like a 3 times, or maybe 2 times 2, 3-ish meter kind of a radius. It was kind of black dusty. After that, pretty much no dust. And now I'll just do my sort of the journey of my first airbrush, and you can sit back and relax and just join in. When I got this airbrush, it was filthy. Someone had used it with paint, not even rinsed it out with water, and put it aside, and everything dried. And a couple of months later on, it was handed over to me. So before I could even start painting, I had to learn how to pick this apart and clean it. And that made me sort of realize 2 things. First thing is that was a really good place to start, because then I knew sort of what this was made out of and how to clean it. Secondly, I learned the importance of keeping the airbrush clean. And what does that mean? Well, when you airbrush, you've got paint, but you're also squirting through air, which dries paint. So something that is kind of common is that you get dry paint on the inside. Either that means it clogs up and not much is coming through. Most of the time it means that there's sort of a little piece of paint dry somewhere, and so when you spray, it comes out in sort of squirts, or it sort of just doesn't spray evenly and things like that. So kind of the hard way of having to really clean an airbrush properly taught me the importance of keeping this clean throughout the entire time I was using it. So when you're when you've got an airbrush, you put in paint, you mix it with whatever you mix it, and you spray paint. And then eventually you need to change paints. So what do you do then? Well, what I did is I poured in water into the cup and tried to rinse out all the excess paint. Not squeezing anything through the muzzle, just through, cleaning the cup out. And once the cup was clean, I poured water in there once more and sort of started spraying it out a couple of times until you basically got an entirely clean airbrush. And then I got the next paint. And this is quite a lot of work. And I guess that's kind of the thing with an airbrush. You have to put in quite a lot of work with either seeing to it that your airbrush is constantly clean or letting it clog up and dry and then spend ages cleaning it. But it's not just sort of like a brush where you just quickly wipe it off and then you're done. It needs sort of constant attention and a bit of love. Now, secondly, after every session that I've been using the airbrush, I never let it dry. I cleaned it out, like I said before, making sure there wasn't any sort of too much paint still in there. And then I kept it in water with a little bit of airbrush cleaner in it until the next time I was going to airbrush. That way, sort of, the little residues of paint that were left in there, they were never allowed to dry. And pretty much every time I came back for the next session and sort of dripped the airbrush off like this, there was actually a little bit of paint coming out. So I think that was a pretty smart thing to do. Now, after I learned how to clean it and, assembled miniatures for ages, I decided that the first thing to start would be to prime everything, obviously. And I figured it would be a really good place to just figure out how this thing works. It's just, I used a black primer and there's, nothing can really go wrong. Like I bought this big bottle of surface primer because I thought, it's going to be an entire army I'm painting here. It's like 40 minis. I'll need a lot of paint. And I think I've used about, that much. There's like this much paint left. I've got like a lifetime supply of black primer here, kind of. So that's when I realized how thin you can paint with an airbrush. And especially for priming, this is awesome. So, I was seriously sort of, at that moment, I started thinking, how can I solve it at home so that I can have an airbrush, if it's even just for the priming. And that's just with the one color. I never actually tried to zenithal prime anything, but I know now that, if you want to do a bit more specific zenithal prime than just having a rattle can that just sort of goes zenithal prime, then you can go sort of a little bit of zenithal prime here on the head and in the shoulders and, a bit on the arms and like be a bit more specific than just, yeah. And I also thought about the cost of like rattle cans. Like I've been painting for about 2 years, gone through, say, 6 or 7 rattle cans. Some of it has gone into sort of terrain, which, devours a lot more. But they're not cheap. So, it's difficult to know how long you're going to be painting for. But if you're going to be painting miniatures for like 3 or 4 years, then you would have saved up the money, I guess, on the airbrush by just priming your miniatures with it and not using rattle can. Don't quote me on that either. But, it's just some quick mathematics sort of drive me in that direction. So once I was done with the priming, it was time to actually start painting things seriously. And I took a decision to try and take this airbrush thing as far as I could and hopefully paint the entire army to the extent that all that was left that needs to be done with a regular brush, is sort of edge highlights. And my first step was starting with the armor. It's a stormcast army. They're all something called a vanguard. And I've dubbed them my stormcast ninja rangers because, they're sort of running about, hiding in bushes. They've got little gun kind of things they shoot with. And yeah, they're ninja rangers basically, and I wanted their armor to be kind of dark black bluish kind of a thing. So I started with a color called abyssal blue, and this was the first time, apart from with the primer where I just sort of ad hoc'd a bit of the dilution, just because it was the first step. This is when I sort of got into the territory of how to dilute paints seriously. And I don't think I have any recommendations that...
Podcast seriously.
Playing podcast seriously. No, Siri, stop! Sorry about that. Okay, dilutions. I think it depends on the brand of the paint. It depends on what color it is. Like different pigments have different... The actual size of the pigment is different. It depends on your climate. Like, is it moist? Is it dry? It depends on the type of airbrush. There's so many variables into how to thin your paints for an airbrush that it's really difficult to give any examples of sort of the correct way of diluting stuff for an airbrush. I don't think there is one. It's all very individual. But what I did notice, because when you've got an airbrush like this, and you're just going to do a little airbrush, so you take like 2 drops of black paint, and then you know that, I need 1 drop of thinner and let's say 1 drop of flow improver, and that's my perfect mixture. Only accidentally, these 2 drops, they were really big. And so when you start spray painting, it's just really thin. And that's a difficulty, I find, when just doing a few drops here and there, is drops can really vary in size. And so what I did was, like with the abyssal blue, I made a batch. And when you make batches of things, like I was working in milliliters, I think, there's a lot less room for big or small drops. You've got like 1 milliliter of that, 1 milliliter of this, and you're pretty close to doing a big mixture. The good thing with making a batch as well is that you can keep on going the next day with exactly the same paint. You can also sort of keep it for when you expand your army in 3 months' time, hopefully, if it hasn't dried out, and you've still got the same mixture. Now, when I started with that first layer of paint on the armor, what I also did, on recommendation actually from a gentleman at my local friendly game store, was like, get a piece of hardboard or MDF or something like that, and every time you mix a paint up or put new paint in your airbrush, you can hold it up and you can just check the flow and see what the paint acts like. If it's too thin and it starts to drip, then obviously it'll act the same on your miniature. Or if the airbrush starts to just sort of squirt out random blobs of paint, it's kind of a bit too thick. And it was a really great tip. The other thing is, I had my trusty sort of test painting mini. So at first, I sort of gradually edged away from him, but I would test spray on my test mini before I went on to, spray paint on the important stuff. So I kept on going with the armor. And after that first layer of abyssal blue, I kind of realized how much detail work I can actually do, because I picked the armor first because mainly these stormcast, they're stormcast, they're really they're mainly about armor. Well, they're mainly about huge shoulder pads, but the rest of them are pretty much armor as well, at least these Vanguard. And I figured something that seems kind of important with airbrush is to figure out where you need to start, because there's some areas on a mini that you probably can't paint with an airbrush without getting paint on somewhere else there where you don't really want it. And in this case, it was the armor. I needed to start with that. And after I did the abyssal blue, I wanted to just sort of do more and more highlights. Imagine yourself sort of a zenithal prime if you're using a rattle can, only you can do it I did this in 4 layers. It was the abyssal blue, and then there was sort of like, I added some gray into that mixture, and then I added some white-ish into that mixture, and then eventually I added a bit more white and a little bit of blue into a fourth mixture, constantly sort of working up the highlights. And with an airbrush, you get a constant gradient. I mean, imagine if you use the rattle cans and you do a zenithal prime, say you've got black and then you dust with a white from up top, you get a nice sort of gradient. And you can do the exact same thing with an airbrush, but you can get really close. So you can choose to just do that on just the one shoulder pad on a Mini. And that's really cool. Now after that, I decided that because these are Stormcast Ninja Rangers, they were going to have camouflage, and they've got fur cloaks. So there was two distinct things that are a color mixture of different, the fur cloaks should have different patterns going, and the camouflage should have different patterns going. And this turned out to be kind of great for the airbrush as well, because of this type of sort of gradients. The only sort of other way I could have gotten these nice sort of blends is by wet blending. And like wet blending 40 cloaks, for me at least, that would have taken quite some time. And then sort of lastly, after all the armor was done and all the cloaks and everything, there was some beasts involved in this army. They're sort of, they're called griff riders or something. It's like bird lions kind of a thing. And so this was the first time I had sort of bigger surfaces to work with on the airbrush, and realized, that was kind of cool as well, especially when doing like, this is the only way I could get an effect like this with like a yellow on almost a black. Imagine trying to wet blend yellow and black. I would fall over and have like spasms. 2.5 egg cartons worth on the guidance of Goobertown Hobbies to use egg cartons as miniature transportation, and like 4 beasts and a ballista and stuff like that. A couple of small birds, in my spare time, in a couple of in the evenings every now and again during the period of like 3 or 4 weeks. And I could not have done that with a brush. This case study of mine of painting an entire army, sort of being able to do batch painting, the fact that it's sort of armor on a lot of it, and then just sort of some cloaks. It was very, very, very fast to paint with an airbrush. And, there's some things that I've been doing here that I could have not have done with the brush. In my eye, it looks sort of airbrushed, which, you can like it or you can dislike it or not even care. It'll get sort of a less of an airbrush look once I go in with the brush and do the highlights and stuff like that. But I mean, just the fact that I can sort of get an army on the table this fast is to me kind of amazing. Now, I just wanted to show you where I think the airbrush excels. I did a very fast paint job of this little ghostly fella from the Night Haunt. Because what the airbrush is really, really good at is gradients. And so basically what I did with this Mini, it was prime black, and then I added a layer of a dark blue. And then from up top, sort of like a zenithal prime, I went in with a dark red from Vallejo. And then I added an orange up top, which, and it turns out kind of a brown, which is what happens with the airbrush, because the paint you paint on, depending on the pigment, obviously, is kind of thin. A lot of times you have to go over with it, the same area quite a few times to get a really vibrant color. Whereas in this case, it's a really bright orange, only I kind of dusted it a few times. So on top of the red, it turns into sort of kind of a brown. I then added a sort of a bit more of a ghostly blue to the ghostly sort of, smoke going. This Stormcast Mini is exactly the kind of Mini that loves an airbrush, because it's all sort of about gradients. And this seriously took me like 2 minutes or less to paint this mini. So for tabletop standards, if you're kind of a person that push out a lot of miniatures, you want to have a lot of different armies going, and the miniatures are sort of like this and not sort of have lots of details going. Say you're doing Nurgle, kind of a chaos thing, or this kind of stuff, or even, you know, like my knights that are just sort of, the armor is just the one color. It can just so be so incredibly fast. What I did on some of these is I actually masked off stuff. In my case, just using blue tack, because that's what I had around. I know Green Stuff World does a great sort of airbrush putty kind of a thing that you can smudge out and cover stuff up. There's also sort of different types of tape that you can mask off and stuff like that. But I just used blue tack for better or worse. But say when I painted these, I basically put blue tack on the entire rider and like the weapon, so that I could paint the bird without getting any paint on the rider. But it was a fair amount of work to you know, make sure I covered all the bits, and then all of a sudden it's not very fast anymore. Just mentioning all the stuff I've been doing. So in the end, should you be getting an airbrush or not? And by the way, if you've been watching this entire video and you already have an airbrush, please leave comments of all the stuff that I missed out, so that people that watch this video that might be deciding to get an airbrush or not can you know, read the comments and see if anything specific pops up why they should or shouldn't be getting one. I think still in my mind, the major thing is to have somewhere to like do with it. I'm going to try and figure out, can I have one in like the basement without telling any of the neighbors, so that they won't ask me why there's like spray dust all over their stuff in the basement? Or should I get one of these spray booth kind of a things that I can just push the other end of it out through the window, or you know, or I don't know. I really want to get an airbrush, mainly because of the priming, because I was kind of stoked at how thin and precise I could get just the surface priming. Secondly, on, you know, depending on what I do, but on certain things, like when I was doing these beasts, it was just so much fun being able to, in a way, blend different colors, or like get gradients of different colors that I would have probably never attempted. Like I've always try and sort of just stay away from yellow, because I think it's a very annoying paint to try and paint. And I haven't finished with these either. There's some things that I want to try later on, like some of them, there's a magician, maybe I can do some sort of OSL, object source lightning kind of a thing on her, which will be a lot easier with sort of gradients on the airbrush. There's also sort of effects of sort of spraying on some dirt or some pigments, liquid pigments and stuff like that. There's definitely, if you would get an airbrush, you would learn to, you know, miss it if you didn't have it. I think it's all a matter of cost and a place to have it. If you got the money to spend, and you know where you can have it, and you know there's no questions, then I would say there's no questions, you should get an airbrush, because it was a lot of fun, and I really liked having an airbrush for about a month. I want to end with just something that was recommended to me, which is like, if you decide to get an airbrush, it's not always recommended to get the cheapest airbrush, because I know there's always really cheap airbrushes around, but there's obviously faults to them. I know I have a neighbor that bought a really cheap one and managed to like break it really quickly. I don't really know how, but it happened. And it's also not really fair on you, because apparently the way an airbrush works can vary. And that doesn't mean that, you know, if you get a really expensive airbrush, you'll get necessarily super better results, or you won't become a better airbrusher. But if you get sort of just one of the bigger brands, like the decent entry model, and not sort of the cheapest brand's cheapest model, you're probably giving yourself a bigger chance to learn how to airbrush, because it is a machine. And if you buy a machine that doesn't work very well, then you'll never get it to work well. Whereas if you buy a machine that is all right, then you can make it work all right. And that being said, there's no point getting the most expensive one as your first airbrush, because you might not like it, and then you spend a lot of money in that department, which is kind of unnecessary. Another thing I wanted to mention, which is with the compressor, which is something I hadn't taken into consideration with the sort of should I buy an airbrush or not, is the sound. This is what this compressor sounds like. So it's not very silent. I usually spend my evenings every now and again painting, which is when my son sleeps. And, if I would be in the living room while he sleeps and my wife is home, this would not be accepted pretty much by neither my sleeping son or my wife, because it's not a very pleasant sound. Especially with this sort of really small compressor. Like if you have a larger compressor, then it has a reservoir for compressed air. So it sort of does this for a little while, and then, it's made sure it's got plenty of compressed air in its reservoir, and you can work away with your airbrush, and then every now and again, sort of the compressor kicks in. This one doesn't have a reservoir, so it sounds like this for the entire time that you're working. So if you're sitting for 2 hours using an airbrush, this is what you'll be listening to for about 2 hours. So that's something to take into consideration as well. Something I'd sort of missed. I really want to get an airbrush. I just have to figure out sort of, there's the dust, there's the sound. And I mean, if you get one of these air vent kind of things, that fan is going to make noise as well. So then it's sort of only airbrushing when no one's home. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I've, done so much work on a lot of minis that would have taken me ages to do with the brush. They have a certain look. I don't mind it. For tabletop, it's just awesome. How fast you can get things on there. I haven't even tried it on terrain. I know that if I would paint some terrain with this, it would probably blow me away. So yeah, get one if you can. If it's not, if you've got the money to spare and the place to have it, I would get an airbrush. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, all these things. Big thanks to my Patreons, and I'll see you around. Bye.